All right, let's go ahead and get started. And before we do that, I'd just like to thank everybody for joining us today, as this is our first webinar in the 2025-26 Forest and Climate Learning Exchange Series. You can see on your screen that we have today, followed by 8 other webinars coming up throughout the year. All webinars take place on the first Wednesday of each month, except for the January webinar, which is the second Wednesday of that month. If you want to see or register for future webinars, you can scan the QR code on the screen right now. We'll also be dropping a link in the chat, and we'll have opportunities later on this webinar to access future upcoming webinars. I would also like to thank our co-hosts for the 25-26 Forest Climate Learning Exchange Series, Society of American Foresters, and thank them for their gracious support of the Learning Exchange Series. So the Society of American Foresters is the national scientific and educational organization representing forestry and related natural resources professionals across the United States. Founded in 1900, SAF promotes science-based sustainable management and stewardship of our nation's public and private forests. If you want to learn more about the work that SAF does and other types of continuing education that they offer, please visit their website by the link in the chat. I would also like to highlight our next webinar for October, where a personal friend and colleague of mine, Sarah Kibbing from the Yale Applied Science Synthesis Program, will be presenting a talk titled Managing Forests in a Changing Climate, where this seminar will be drawing on research from Yale's Applied Science Synthesis Program, asking the question, how can we manage forests in a changing world and sustain the vital services that forests provide? We've also provided a link for that webinar in the chat as well, so we hope to see you all there. Today, though, we are joined by Dr. Melissa Kreye from Penn State University, as well as the director of the Forest Owner Carbon and Climate Education Program at Penn State University, where she will be giving a talk titled Engaging and Supporting Family Forest Owners in Climate Smart Forestry. We will also be putting a link in the chat to the FOSSI program if you'd like to access a ton of really good extension articles, as well as other resources available to landowners across the eastern US to better engage with the carbon economy. But before we get started, just the last few housekeeping things. So at the end of this webinar, we will be having a moderated Q&A session. So if there are questions that you want asked, you want points of clarification, or maybe just want to hear from our experts, please use either the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to address all or as many questions as we can, or feel free to use the chat function and send a message to the host and panelists. I would also encourage you all to join our mailing list to kind of stay up to date on all news as well as events and other ongoing activities that we're doing at the Forest Carbon and Climate Program, where myself, Dr. Chad Papa, I direct the FCCP, and we send out a bi-monthly newsletter that has ongoing research and resources available to landowners and practitioners, all related to carbon and climate. So the last thing before I hand it over to Melissa is this webinar is qualified for CFEs through the Society of American Foresters. And so if you are looking to get CFE credits, if you have registered for this webinar with the same email as your SAF account, you don't need to do anything. Those credits will automatically be applied to your account. But if you're using a different email, please contact SAF at cf@safnet.org. So with that, I am going to hand off this presentation to Melissa. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Chad. I'm really happy to be here, and I'm really happy to share the stuff that I have going on. Always got stuff going on. So I will start up my presentation here. You are screen sharing, and I'm going to put it into presentation mode. There we go. So, yeah, as Chad said, I'm an associate professor at Penn State in the Department of Ecosystem Science and Management, and I am in forestry extension, and I do a lot of social science work and economics work, and most recently in the last few years, been around climate smart forestry and carbon management. So, today's talk is going to be an overview of my research and extension programs. So to get started, just in case people aren't aware, most forest land in the U.S. is under some kind of private ownership, and the largest category of private ownership are family forest owners. So these family forest owners are responsible for an average of 22 metric tons of carbon per acre in those trees in the living biomass above ground. And those trees sequester carbon all the time, between 1 to 4 metric tons of carbon per year, especially it's higher in the southeast and in the Appalachian region in the northwest. We aren't harvesting as much as we used to historically. So we have more trees growing than are lost. And so that means in the United States, our forests are already offsetting up to 12% of our emissions every year, which is great because some countries, their forests aren't providing this free service. So through just voluntary changes in behavior, slowdowns in harvesting, we're already offsetting our emissions. And there's predictions that say that maybe we could get another 10% reduction in emissions through forest management. So there's some interest in seeing how we can do that. Just to sort of get everybody on the same page in terms of defining climate smart forestry, I think we're coming around to some pretty common ways of defining it across different areas of expertise. Mine tends to be more carbon focused, but in general, it's basically a variety of actions. You can create new forests, obviously, to sequester more carbon. You can protect carbon stocks by protecting forest health and resilience. There's this more specific term in the US called improved forest management, which has to do with working on working forest lands that are already actively managed and tweaking those management actions in order to increase the amount of carbon stocks on the landscape. And usually that has to do with extending harvest rotations is like one of the fastest ways to do that, but it does involve a bunch of other practices that help protect carbon stocks while you're managing. And then, of course, sustainable wood products is where we store our, forest-based carbon offsite in houses and construction, which provide a lot of carbon storage benefits as well. So climate smart forestry is really not a specific set of management practices. There's a change in management that occurs that ends up either adding extra protection to carbon stocks or enhancing the amount of carbon that's on the landscape. So that's what's climate smart. And so it's not new forestry, it's the same, but it's just applied differently. The planning's done a little bit differently to shift protection towards those carbon stocks or enhance those carbon stocks. In the US, this is a table we pulled from, I believe, Berkeley, where they're monitoring, how many projects are going on in terms of forest carbon offsets in the United States. And we've got your reforestation, afforestation projects, we got avoided conversion, but improved forest management is the most dominant form of a carbon offset project. And this makes sense. As I said earlier, the US has a lot of forest lands that are getting to mature ages, which means that they're getting ready to be harvested. There's a strong private property right, so that helps encourage harvesting on private land. So managing to enhance carbon stocks on working forests is the most common approach used. Some may be saying, well, is there going to be demand in the future for these offsets, And I just wanted to pull up right here, just really quickly, a report by Climate Impact Partners that they did their own survey of global Fortune 500 companies in regards to their plans for reducing their carbon emissions and meeting their own goals. And this is just one table from that report that that just basically shows that among Fortune 500 companies, they still have plans to become carbon neutral. 8% are trying to achieve that today, and 17% by 2030, and then 33% by 2050. And so there is momentum. Whether or not they're buying offsets right now is there's probably a pause. There's all kinds of reasons for the pause. There's concern about the quality of the credits that are being produced. But then there's also internal factors in terms of if they want to, have science based goals, then they need to really determine more accurately what are their emissions and that they're going to be offsetting. And then really what is it that they can do differently before buying carbon offsets? What can they do differently to reduce their emissions? So there's a lot of reconfiguring going on, which means the voluntary market, carbon market space right now is not hot as it was a year or two ago, but it's not necessarily disappearing either. Okay, so when it comes to family forest owners and their involvement in the carbon program, this is one of the few first papers that I've come across. This isn't my research. The rest of this talk will be my research. This is just one that was able to look into what is the real uptake among family forest owners to carbon programs. And this one focuses on the Family Forest Carbon Program, which has they pay based on management practices that improve health, forest health and resilience, and enhances carbon stocks. And they're long commitments; they're 20-year commitments. And what they found is like less than 1% of eligible owners have actually enrolled, and around 7% are still in the process of meaning they're thinking about enrolling or they considered they declined. So it's not happening quickly among family forest owners. However, as you will see in the research that I've done, there's a lot of interest. So there's this mismatch that's happening. There's the reality of the opportunities, and then there's the desire among a lot of family forest owners for additional streams of revenue and being a good land steward. And so one of the findings here and the findings my research too is that time commitment is the biggest barrier because of the average age of forest owners in the US being older. And then if you can't combine both carbon payments with timber harvesting revenues, it doesn't really make a lot of economic sense unless you can get both of those outcomes within your lifetime. Because we're talking about family forests, not industrial forest lands. I work under the framing of market failures, like how do we resolve or not resolve, but at least help contribute to the resolution of a market failure through educational initiatives. And when a lot of people think about what's causing market failures and carbon offsets, it's often this idea like there's something wrong with the commodity, there's something wrong with the carbon credit, and we're trying to take something that was a public good, carbon sequestration, and turn it into a private good so we can sell it on a market. So that's that carbon credit. And so I've defined it as like being this combination of we just have incomplete information to really how do we best set up protocols and standards? Who are these governing bodies? How do they function? What about rights and ownership over the carbon, over the forests? What about the pressures on forests and the risk of carbon release? There's all kinds of things that research needs to be done. This is not the research that I do. I do the research in the human dimension space, which has to do with looking at the social will to use private forest lands to mitigate climate change. And that social will is both a function of like what's viable in markets as well, or what are the implications of having these markets. So I look into questions of public views and consent regarding forest management, including carbon trade-offs that may occur if we focus on carbon management. What are the financial impacts to landowners? What are the economic impacts of shifting to a new market like carbon credits, which, would it be in competition with wood products? These kinds of questions. And then, of course, these corporate buyers and individual buyers, what are their needs and behaviors? So this is the area that I own on the bottom right. I always like to bring up one of my papers. It's a couple years old, but I think this really lays the groundwork for how I think about the work that I do. And what this is from basically do qualitative work. We did some interviews with landowners and focus groups, and basically to help create this model of decision making. So when you combine values-based objectives with financial considerations, there's this question of like, what should I be paid to do? And what is it that I am responsible for protecting wildlife habitat, carbon, et cetera, on my forest land? So there's this balancing act that's happening. And this willingness to pay to provide stewardship benefits and public goods versus what they're willing to accept payment for, has to do with their perspective for their forest land and based on their forest stand, the condition of their forest stand and what they intend to do with it. And that this has more to do with personal achievement outcomes for family forest owners. So when we look at like financial feasibility, it has to be related to their values and what they want beyond just revenues. So this is not a group of people that are here to maximize revenues at any cost. So decision making frames that I deal with all the time in extension is like recognizing that the landowners have to have some skin in the game, some motivation that's internal in order to do stewardship activities. And then they benefit from my programming because I work with that assumption, which is based on my research. It's got to be financially feasible. A lot of times they're making decisions based on their current needs. They see their forest as an asset out there that's held in reserve until they need something from it. And they're really interested in stacking income streams. So carbon should be a great thing, right? It should be great. Okay, so when I got into this space, the first thing I did was a meta-analysis of existing willingness to accept payment studies. Over the last couple decades, we found 13 studies that were comparable to do this meta-analysis. And what we found was that willingness to accept values to manage from mostly a delay harvest kind of scheme ranged anywhere between $5 per acre per year to $350 per acre per year. Wow. There's something going on there that is showing like opportunity costs are significantly vary across the different types of forest owners. So how do we make sure that compensation is fair and also, helping them, pay their taxes and keep their forest as forests? So half of these willingness to accept values were 75% less than the other half. So what's in this opportunity cost area that we need to look into? And that's what my upcoming research is doing. And obviously there was a lot of values-based decision making. We wanted to understand like who would be these early adopters. And so what we did is we took our model and we created scenarios based on different types of forest owners. So we've got a passive forest owner who is like, look, I just want extra money. I don't want to make long commitments, and I don't really have any experience in managing or have a management plan. So it's going to take a little bit of work for them. Then we've got the conservation stewardship oriented owner who is like, I want to protect this forest into the future. I'm willing to make long commitments. I understand some stuff about forest management. And then the timber production oriented owners are like, I already have an investment plan in place, and changing that plan is going to come at some real trade-offs that I can quantify in terms of like extending harvest rotations and the implications for our selling that wood later. And so we developed these characters and we designed contracts for each of them using our model. And what we found was that the passive forest owner and the conservation stewardship oriented owner were willing to accept values obviously much less than the timber production oriented owners. So obviously perceptions and real opportunity costs were much higher for forest owners that were more timber production oriented. The green values here too are actually within the range of existing payment levels in carbon programs, so between $5 and $20 per acre per year. And so it would be reasonable to assume that if we go and talk to people who have enrolled in a carbon program, maybe they would fall in these two categories of passive owner or conservation stewardship owner. And that's exactly what we found. This is, once again, qualitative. We just went and interviewed people that we knew had enrolled in programs and asked them about themselves and why they did it. And yeah, low revenue maximizing motives. They were already enrolled in other kinds of programs, so they had experience meeting contract obligations. They were looking to stack incomes, and there were some features of the contract that were really important to them. They paid attention to the payment mechanism. Was it annually? Um, how many acres could they enroll? Any sort of certifications that were maybe had to be associated with it, and then the length of contract was also a particular interest. So that is other people's research that we put in a meta-analysis, and it is all very hypothetical because all of that happened before real carbon markets came on the scene for family forest owners. So ongoing right now, Kripa Nupani is my PhD student, and she is surveying landowners in Pennsylvania and Virginia, and we are putting forward using a choice experiment, an option to enroll in a variety of programs that look really similar to what is actually available now. So it's still hypothetical in that they're not really entering a program, but they are being offered programs that look very much like what could be a real option now. And I'm just going to briefly introduce some of the early findings. So don't hold any of this, as like this is the end result. But this is sort of the general trends. So we have about 243 responses. Um, what we found is that carbon management does require compensation. Carbon is seven or eighth in ranking in terms of their management priorities. Much, much higher are things like legacy wildlife habitat, and then going down the list, the more active stuff like timber management and other kinds of market goods are a little bit lower. And carbon is right down there too. So if they're going to have to go more carbon focused management, they need to be compensated. But we haven't found any evidence of any like systematic preference across all those surveyed for any particular carbon management approach, which is good because climate smart forestry is not about a specific practice. It is about changing from a business as usual activity to something different that enhances carbon stocks or protects carbon stocks. Um, Another finding was the folks that answered the survey, they were willing to be interested in about half of the programs on offer. So I will acknowledge, though, that respondents to these kinds of surveys, these forest owner surveys, which I've done many, tend to be the more engaged forest owner. So this is not going to be well representative of more passive forest owners, people who have forests on their land, but they don't really do that much with it. Um, so the people that responded to the survey so far, about half of them have a forest management plan. And yeah, so which means that's much higher than the average in the population, which is closer to around 10% of forest owners have some kind of forest management plan. So do acknowledge who is responding to this survey. In the model so far, the largest impact on whether or not they would enroll in a program had to do with their knowledge and attitudes towards carbon management. And so once again, this internal motivation has the largest predictor of whether or not they would really consider a carbon program. This was also really interesting too. Their perceived ability to manage carbon didn't increase the likelihood of enrollment. So, this question of like, would they, if they don't have the skills and abilities, would that somehow interfere with their willingness to participate? And it's like, well, there are people who believe they have skills and abilities. And I think if they have a forest management plan, they probably very well do. Um, what this is saying to me right now is that these are the folks that are like, I have a plan. There's real cost to changing that plan. Payment levels aren't high enough right now. So once again, the question of who are the early adopters going to be? Probably those that are a little bit more naive or not as experienced in forest management because the opportunity cost isn't as high for them. We found the likelihood of entering the contract went down by 33% if it was a 20-year contract compared to a 1-year contract. And in fact, the most preferred contract was 5 years because going into a contract every year does require like extra work every year to just review the terms and agreements. So maybe a 5-year rotation was something that people just found a little bit more that they could get their hands around. And upfront payments were more preferred compared to an annual payment or tax incentive. So once again, this is showing financial feasibility and helping, make forest management, actually happen is something that's a priority among these respondents. So concluding my conclusion here is like education is important. You do need, education training to promote interest and positive attitudes towards carbon management and how to manage carbon. But it's very clear that designing acceptable programs is really, really necessary. That, it's not just about, getting people motivated. They have to have opportunities that are a good fit for their management objectives. And so we are looking at ways how we can do this here at Penn State. So Margarita Fernandez is a postdoctoral researcher here in the Department of Ecosystem Science and Management. And she and I got a McIntyre Stennis grant to basically look into the question of how does managing for carbon under some protocols that were put out by Vera and the Family Forest Carbon Program, how does managing for carbon in that way in Pennsylvania support bird habitat? And so we are going to properties that have been enrolled in carbon programs and some that are unenrolled. And we're looking at the presence and absence of birds. And we're also looking at carbon storage potential on those places as well, with the idea that we can encourage landowners to manage for birds, which a lot of them want to do, which is more of a priority, and find out what are the carbon benefits of doing that. For me, this kind of approach to climate smart forestry, I think is just going to resonate much better with forest landowners than a carbon focused approach. And so we're looking at the feasibility of how can we package this a little different that makes more sense to our clients and to forest owners in the US. Other ongoing research that I have is more international in scale. So I got a grant here from Penn State from the Climate Consortium to travel with a team of folks, including Chad here today, to different carbon offset projects for forest-based ones throughout North America and South America. So we have gone to Colombia and Argentina. We're going to Brazil in a few months here. And of course, we're doing work here in Pennsylvania. And what we're doing is we're setting up stakeholder discussion groups to really start looking into the needs of these offset projects in terms of how can we help them have assurances that they're high integrity and that they're socially responsible. And a needs assessment is a concept that comes from extension where you don't do the research and then you just send it out into the universe. You first talk to the people, find out what they need, what are their challenges and their limitations, and then design research and education around those needs. And so that was what we were doing. So we were going to these places and saying, what are the challenges and what are the opportunities you're facing, and how can academics help meet some of those needs? Because up until now, academics has sort of been on like the fringe edge of conversations about forest carbon offsets. It's largely been led by the private sector. And yeah, the question now is like, how can we serve as, an objective third party and provide benefits as well? So I'll just share with you some of the results that we have so far in terms of what kind of education needs there are. And so what we found, and this is common across all the sites so far, of course, we need education to enhance transparency and trust in what carbon offset projects are and how they provide benefits locally as well as globally. There's a need for general awareness of projects and their economic viability. It sounds a little crazy, like we're growing trees to store carbon, but aren't they doing that already? Where are these projects located? Are they actually able to, be economically viable and provide, financial benefits to the forest owner, to the buyers that are buying the credits, so there is a need for just understanding, who are the actors in this economy, and then, who are the stakeholders as well. And then, of course, mentioning stakeholders, how can we improve communication with stakeholders? I think one of the things I've discovered here in Pennsylvania and throughout the Eastern US is that a key stakeholder is the wood products industry. And there's been just not very good communication with them. And there's been a lot of concern about like, there's this, is there going to be competition between wood products and carbon credits? And it's just not clear to people. And so there's a real need to help provide this clarity so conversations can move forward in terms of policy and any other sort of governing in this carbon economy space. Of course, we need specialized technical and commercial training all the time. Workforce development is going to be key in making sure that, these projects are not only get off the ground, but are maintained into the future. And thinking long-term continuity, how can education, uh, you know, help prepare the next generation of stakeholders as well as professionals, and what role does extension have there? So these are just some of our early findings, and I'm going to be using them in basically this model that I have for how I think about what education looks like in terms of promoting climate smart forest management. And my research has shown that basically, yeah, lack of transparency, low trust is the first barrier to overcome. And the way that we gain social approval for using forests, for managing for all kinds of ecosystem services, as well as carbon, is to collaborate with trusted institutions. All stakeholders should be at the table. And we should build engagement by providing resources that have foundational information and develop tools for discovery so people can, check out like what's going on in this space without being overwhelmed with a bunch of technical information and jargon and feel like they're in over their head. So building engagement and feeling like they have social approval to do so is really key. And then finally, we need to help provide the skills to manage for forest carbon. So help determine what's financially feasible, how can they understand the needs of their forest. All these things stack together and have to be addressed like simultaneously and can be. And that's what we do with the FOSSI program. So the Forest Owner Carbon and Climate Education Program was funded through a NEFA grant back in 2021. And yeah, it is a cooperative of multiple extension institutions throughout the Eastern US, including 3 USDA climate hubs, with the goal of co-creating information and delivering that information to our clients. The idea behind having a cooperative effort was just built on the reality that some extension institutions have capacity to generate this content and some don't, and yet forests are everywhere. And so if we do it together, then we can, obviously benefit from this collective effort. Our goals. First goal is build confidence in carbon management. Notice I did not say first goal is to get people enrolled in a carbon program. Not all carbon programs are good for all people in all situations. So this is our impact goal. Build confidence in making decisions about carbon management and program enrollment, offering them access to new tools and resources to make those decisions, fostering community and, that social acceptance part, fostering community around carbon and climate topics. Of course, we want to make sure that we have equitable access to all of our information, so reaching underserved forest owners. And then also advocating for new ways to think about carbon management and carbon incentives, which is part of the Carbon Bird project that I have going on here, is like, how can we think differently in achieving, our climate health goals as well as supporting private forest lands? And so the approaches we use, as I mentioned, we co-design curriculum. We have a lot of online resources available. And so probably go in the chat box now. We've got a library of over 24 articles, I think about 60,000 views, and they cover everything from forest management. This is all introductory level because the idea is that we're helping build confidence across a wide variety of landowners who are new to this subject. How to manage forest carbon, what are the economics around it? What are decision making, strategies that I could use to decide whether or not a program or an approach is good for me. Of course, we do lots of extension talks. Peer education programs, once again, builds that social acceptance of climate smart forestry, and there's professional development training for extension professionals. And this development training too is also open to peer educators who bridge that gap into reaching folks that, maybe extension professionals wouldn't be able to access. Oh yeah, so here's our screenshot of our website for the Library of Extension articles. Uh, we went with three questions. How do I manage forest carbon? What are the benefits of managing forest carbon with the understanding that, values-based decision making is the way we understand benefits? And then, what should I consider in a carbon contract? How do I make these kinds of decisions? And I don't have it in here, but we are currently under contract very soon here to also create a chatbot way to interface with this library among resources that are available from, our partners as well. And so, folks can have a conversation with an artificial intelligence that's going to be only drawing content from our closed library of resources. So they know that it's been something that's been vetted through our extension professionals, and they're not getting, hallucinations from other places, other forms of information from throughout the internet. So we're going to be testing this platform, and I'm pretty interested to see how people respond and potentially use it. So got some movement forward there. If you work with forest owners in any capacity and want to be prepared to talk about carbon management and carbon markets, we have an online course. It's self-paced, asynchronous course. We got 10 modules covering management, the economics aspects and planning aspects. We got videos and reading assignments. And guess what? You get to choose your own modules based on your needs or your audience's needs. So this is a great place, especially if you just are very new to the subject and you really just want to start putting your feet in and getting a little wet and exploring it. That's the purpose of this course. And so, and yeah, you get continuing education credits too. Feel free to reach out to me. I believe it's on the website, so you can go and register there too. Okay, so two resources coming up in the future I'm pretty excited about. Um, Hopefully coming out in the next month or two. I introduced this as a motivation to finish it up, right? So one of the things I felt like would be really helpful is basically giving forest owners a planning guide, because they're getting lost in the details. And so what this planning guide does is, through a step-by-step process, regardless of any experience that they have before. If you have a management plan, great. If you don't, we have options for you too. At the end of going through this planning guide, they should be able to produce an estimate of how much carbon is stored in their forest. It could be an average based on, FIA data, or it could be something based off of their management plan. They could learn about how management history and future choices influence carbon storage. They'll be able to align their carbon goals with their personal values and economic priorities or financial priorities, or however they want to approach that comparison. So it's sort of, there's like a decision tree kind of flow chart. And then, of course, recognize when to consult a professional. So they already have their ideas in hand. They can be ready to have like a real meaningful conversation with a professional after going through this planning guide. And so that's our intention. We're going to be testing it here in the next few months, and I'm pretty excited about it. As a companion guide, we have been working with NIAX to develop basically a tool to assess risk and actions for resilience in changing forests. So NIAX has worked with other states to create the same sort of decision-making tool. So we're finally getting one here in Pennsylvania. And yeah, once again, it's a checklist that landowners can do themselves, or they can work with a professional to go through their property and start to identify particular risks and what actions they can start to take, and sort of rank them and help them get an idea. Okay, like now I can approach what's kind of, a pretty difficult topic, talking about forest health. we don't know what a healthy forest looks like, but we sure know what an unhealthy forest looks like. So it's kind of it's kind of hard to figure out, how do we broach this subject. So they'll be able to do property level assessments, looking at forest diversity and composition and structure and the potential for tree regeneration, which is the primary problem with future carbon stocks in Pennsylvania. So I believe that gets me to the end of my presentation, and I left time to answer questions because so often we just don't leave time. And I'm really just interested to hear from folks. And yeah, so I'm happy to take questions. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Melissa. That was a lot of information, a lot of great information. So yeah, we have a couple questions I think we can just jump into. First one being, are you aware of any similar entities to the Forest Owner Carbon and Climate Education Program or FOSSI program that is maybe focused on other parts of the US and specifically the Western US?
So more west we go, the less familiar I am. I apologize, and I know that that would be helpful. So there are a number of project developers that work with family forest owners, and before I'm gonna share a couple things about this. So first of all, as an extension representative, I get asked this question all the time. Hey, what are the programs around? And so being that this is a new space, I have to be careful as a professional not to, promote any one program over the other. I do use the Family Forest Carbon Program because they're part of some of the research questions that we have. And also, yeah, they've been very open and transparent. So I've mentioned them a number of times. I will say too that the types of programs that exist, the Family Forest Carbon Program is sort of a different example. They're kind of set up more like a cost share for practices kind of contract, whereas other carbon program projects are more focused on like you will be paid based on directly on the amount of carbon stored on the landscape, additional carbon storage on your landscape. And some may or may not pay attention to, what other management activities or practices you're doing. Some project developers operate more as like a consultant where you're in charge of the project, but then they come and they do the monitoring and inventorying. Usually industrial forest landowners are going to be and they're going to run the project and then they hire the workforce to kind of complete it. That's not feasible for family forest owners, not at all. So there's an in between where there are some project developers will say, we can work together jointly, and I'll help fill in the gaps of your limitations, but it's going to be flexible in terms of like what you want to do, how you want to manage. And then there's some programs where like it's already decided how you're going to manage it. The contracts are kind of like pre-prepared and kind of fixed. So those are like the three categories. Um, and I'll just reduce risk of mentioning any particular one. In Eastern US, we have, in addition to Family Forest Carbon, is the Forest Carbon Works. We've got programs called A New Finite Carbon. Where'd my other list go? There's a growing number, and some of you guys are on here right now. I know, and I probably haven't mentioned your name. Land Yield is another one. So feel free in the chat box to help out with this question of like maybe who's in the West and who's working with what kinds of landowners.
I'll also add quickly as well that our final webinar of the Learning Change series is by Puskar Kannel at Clemson University, who also has a project where he's developing a climate smart forestry education program for professionals specifically to the southeastern US. So again, maybe not the West as well, but that's just another opportunity to learn about some other type of extension and outreach engagement efforts going on across the US. Um, I'm going to throw out another question. I think that is really important, and it is how I would say both how and where do you see the potential for folks working in extension or other outreach engagement with landowners to help them understand the complexity of contracts related to forest carbon payment programs?
So what's the potential of extension helping supporting decision making about contracts, is what you said?
Yes.
Um, I think there's really good potential. I think there's a lot of models out there already. So making a decision about any contract requires multiple types of advice. So, of course, as an educator, I'm not a lawyer. So I am not going to provide any individual very specific advice regarding their contract. I think that's a dangerous path to go on. However, what we can do and what we have done is provide guidelines and also provide insights and like these are the things you're going to see in a contract. And if you don't see certain things, red flag there too, right? And then this is the way you may want to think about it. So, it's the clauses that you need to pay attention to. It's the what happens if something goes wrong, if there is an accidental release, who is responsible, if it's an intentional release, what are the penalties at play? How can I withdraw from a contract? Usually there's a clause like every 6 years. You may be able to get out with fewer penalties. And so it's bringing to light that, these are the things you should pay attention to and ways to go about thinking about it. But of course, I'm talking to forest owners in general and not to a specific individual who has a very specific circumstance. And of course, they would need to get legal advice in that case.
Kind of building on that question as well, thinking about the payment schemes that some of these programs have. So there's obviously a preference for upfront payments, right, to landowners. That's maybe more attractive to a landowner thinking about enrolling in a project. But do you have any ideas how this can be best implemented regarding kind of this payment program, especially with this idea that there is growing wildfire risk in the US? So I could see there being maybe some future conflict if there's increased upfront payments, more people could enroll, and that could maybe exacerbate wildfire risk at the same time.
Yeah. Lots of uncertainty in the future. Okay, so in a kind of a very simplistic arrangement, it would be the case where the forest owner doesn't get paid until the carbon credit is sold, which happens in some time in the future. Um, However, that puts the risk on the landowner. If like a wildfire comes through, then they lose their carbon stocks and then yeah, and then they don't get paid. Um, Being paid up front is really important for making forest management financially feasible because then they can make improvements. And there's a lot, there's a lot of forests that need improvements, and managing pests and diseases, invasive species, and doing some selective thinnings and harvesting to help promote tree growth and healthy trees and increase, diversity in stand age and species composition, all kinds of stuff. So upfront payments can really help achieve that goal. Um, yeah, it's going to come down to a question of like, who is willing to assume the risk, and then what are those risks, and so that's the way you have to think about it. If you are the forest owner in coming into this space, and then as the project developer, they're also having to think about business risks and giving out money ahead of time and then potentially not getting that that carbon credit later is not a very good business plan all the time if there's a high risk. One thing to think about is maybe working with project developers that aren't so beholden to getting high revenues for their investors. And, so groups that are nonprofit maybe will not see maximizing revenues as the ultimate goal, so to speak. So, that's one way to think about it too.
So a follow-up question there is, sorry, I've lost my notes. This is, I guess, more related to just more broad landowner engagement, but do you have any kind of best strategies or practices how to best reach forest landowners? And how would you work past some of the initial barriers that you mentioned in your talk?
Yeah, yeah. So know your audience, For some people, money talks. For some people, yeah, you're going to talk about things that they care, that the other things they care about, right? I would say that the initial interest in my programming did come from people who really were like looking to have multiple streams of income to help support their forest land objectives. They eventually found out that most of the projects that are available, and I think this question was in the chat box too, most of them are improved forest management projects, which involve extending harvest rotations or delaying harvest. And this is not really a good fit for forest owners who are generally, older, near retired, are retired, and they're looking to get harvesting within their lifetime. And so there's a fundamental conflict in terms of timing and with the age of the forest owner, the age of the forest in the United States, and the length of these contracts. So it's not like that's the wrong way to manage carbon. It's just sort of what has emerged. And also paying, someone to delay harvest. I like to say paying them not to do something is, a little bit more easy to kind of create than to, say, develop projects that have to do with a major overhaul in restoring that forest land. So, enhancement plantings and, doing selective cuts and all that's really expensive upfront action. And then, so it's these just I'll pay you to wait a little while projects that are, economically feasible at this point because of the price of on the carbon market right now. Um, I might have migrated away from the question a little bit. Did I cover it?
Um, I think you did a fairly good job. I guess just last part being um like maybe some best practices to work past some of the initial
Oh, yes,
barriers.
that's right. Okay. So, yeah, I sure did migrate. I apologize. I tangented. So yeah. Um, for early engagement, go to them. And so I like to, to like go to events and places where they are already there. It is their territory. They're comfortable here. Know what's important to them, and then speak to them through that lens. So, I've gone to a lot of Forest Landowner Association meetings. I've been to conferences. I've been to, we have something called Ag Progress Days, which is like agricultural forum here in Pennsylvania. And it is there where it's like, you like birds, you want to protect your legacy, here. And then, oh, by the way, carbon payments are kind of in the list of one of the things you can do. And so it's more of like part of a larger resources about managing forest. It's introduced in that way. It's not, I wouldn't approach people and go like, okay, let's talk about carbon markets. You should be on this. That would be intimidating and, potentially, get people nervous and they wouldn't hang out. So that's the really early engagement. And then from there, you create programs that, focus on the needs of the individual. So like, for example, a lot of women forest owners, they're the last ones maybe owning the land. Men generally die before women, so they're trying to make some decisions, and it's like, well, women like to get together and talk. So we have like discussion groups, and it's sort of like a book club, and they get to learn not just about climate smart forestry, but legacy planning, because that's what they're thinking about at that time. So again, it's just like matching what their priorities are and their situation, and then bringing in carbon management in a way that, is beneficial and makes sense. And I found that that's been pretty well received. I'll go ahead and say that I think it's up to 70% of Americans, this is based on a Yale survey that's done on a regular basis, up to 70% of Americans believe that climate change has the potential to harm plants and animals. So it's not this taboo thing anymore in terms of like a far out idea. It is something that people are generally accepting, but they want to know that they're in a safe place to have a conversation about it, and it's focused on what they think is important.
Great. Thank you so much. I guess as we wrap up here, I'm again going to just put up a notice of our next upcoming webinar on October 1st from 3 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time. That again will be given by Dr. Sarah Kibbing from the Yale Applied Science Synthesis Program on managing forests in a changing world. So again, thank you so much, Melissa, for joining us and providing a wealth of information related to how you are supporting forest landowners in the eastern U.S. There also are QR codes on the screen if you want to check out our Learning Exchange Series website, where you can register for any of our upcoming webinars, as well as view our entire catalog that goes back to 2018 of all of our webinars throughout the years, and then another QR code if you want to just directly register for Sarah's webinar coming up in October. So again, thank you everybody for your engagement, for your questions, and I hope you found this talk as informative as I did. And I hope to see you all next month in our next Learning Exchange series. So thank you again and have a good afternoon.
Thanks.